Hello, Rebecca speaking. Yeah, hi there. Sorry, I was a bit crackly before. I couldn't hear who you were. No, that's all right. Are you calling with Skype or something like that? Yeah, no, that's usually the explanation, isn't it? Well, you need to, I guess in terms of your personality, you need to be a relatively curious person in that you want to understand how things work. And I guess in terms of skills, attention to detail as well as, quantitative skills are always highly valued in academia, especially in the sciences. Um, an example for attention to detail, was that what you asked? Yeah, okay. Um, hmm. I guess so. In with regard to um, sort of volcanology, working with deposits of past eruptions, it's often the sort of finer scale observations that um, have the most meaning. So, it's a good example. It's a good question. I'm just trying to think about some of my work in New Zealand because I'm working on quite a difficult historic eruption. Trying to think about that. Hmm. Yeah. A lot of the work I do, like volcanology, is just full of terms. It's a really term. It's not a science that's very friendly to a layperson or the public. So it's just a matter of formulating formulating that in my brain. Okay. Yeah. So okay, let me try and explain. So I guess in terms of why volcanology is important, it's because we want to understand uh, some of the processes that occur in the magma as it's rising to the surface that drives the physical behaviour of the eruption itself. So volcanic eruptions, they're generally not sustained. They generally don't stop and then start. They go through transitions. And it's those transitions which are really sort of pivotal points at which eruption columns can maintain their height, or eruption columns can collapse and form these sort of ground-hugging density currents, which are a significant hazard for communities that live on the flanks of volcanoes. And so we want to try and understand the transitions of behaviour. And when volcanoes erupt in modern time, so now, we can understand those transitions because we have satellite data. We're often using drones and video observations to characterise those transitions. But in historic times, we've never really experienced a very large volcanic eruption of the type that's recorded in the geological record. So I'm talking more about the 1 per 10,000 years, the 1 per 100,000 year eruptions. So sort of those eruptions that come from supervolcanoes, which if they happen today would be devastating on a sort of a global scale. And so when we're working on the volcanic deposits on land from those prehistoric eruptions, you have to work at a large scale in order to understand the scale and the size and the volume of the eruption. But in order to understand the transitions that drive different types of behaviour, we have to look in very fine detail at the clasts themselves, the clasts from the eruption, and what those clasts them. What's that? Clasts, so like the pumice clasts, for example. Yeah, we have to look at those in really fine detail because they're the physical record of the eruption. So we look at the products on a regional scale, mapping out the deposits in order to characterise size and volume and magnitude. But then we have to look in much more detail at the class because they were magma formerly, and they're recording the physical process that brought magma from the deep earth up to the surface. Hopefully that's a good example. Yeah, so observation skills and an eye for detail. And reasoning skills is also quite good because ultimately you have a lot of data and you need to be able to, quantify that data and reason and use it to form an argument that essentially backs up your interpretation. Mm-hmm. And it's yep. I was just, so things are things like, another good example. Yes, I guess we could then move to monitoring. So, when we monitor volcanoes, we monitor them on with various technologies, and we monitor them on various scales. So, for example, most people probably recognise that we monitor volcanoes through seismic activity, eruptions, but we can also monitor volcanoes by looking at the amount and the types of gas that's coming out of volcanoes. We monitor them in terms of how they inflate. So when magma intrudes into the shallow volcanic edifice, the volcano actually inflates, and we can monitor that based on ground sensors and or satellites. Now, with volcanic eruptions, you don't get a nice record of low activity, moderate activity, high activity. It's more sort of like a roller coaster path. And so we often have to use our reasoning skills and our and other forms of evidence, such as the historic activity of that volcano, in order to come up with an interpretation about whether the activity that we're monitoring is at a level that's likely to proceed into an eruption. And we use all the monitoring data sets that we have available to us to make that decision. Yes? The biggest challenge in volcanology? Okay. So the reason that volcanology is a science is because a lot of the third world lives on the flanks, well, even the Western world lives on the flanks of very dangerous volcanoes. And they live on the flanks of volcanoes because the ground is really fertile and nutritious. And so a lot of the Western world are farmers, and so they're farming on lands that are effectively on the flanks and even at nearly quite close to the summits of volcanoes. And so the interpretations, the data that we acquire through monitoring or looking at the deposits of past eruptions, and how we convey that to emergency managers and first responders is kind of the really essential part of our science. And yeah, and so I think the most challenging part is that volcanoes, they're not like other hazards. They're not like hurricanes where, you see it coming and you can predict how intense it's going to be, how long it's going to be. With volcanoes, we can predict the when fairly well, but we can't predict the what and the how big very well at all. And so we have to convey levels of uncertainty in our data to government officials, government organisations, emergency responders and emergency management agencies in a way that effectively describes the impending hazard. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the most challenging part of volcanology, is that we just don't have the capacity at the moment to give emergency managers and agencies that sort of the what and how big information that they need. And there's been lots of examples where historically, like in the last, say, 2 or 3 decades, for example, Pinatubo 1991, which was a really successful integration of the science of volcanology and emergency management agencies, when volcanologists gave their information to emergency managers and things that said to evacuate, and when they evacuated and got everyone out, then the volcano erupted, and that was a sort of a done deal. It was a big success. But there's been other events, such as Montserrat in 1995, I think it was, where Montserrat's an island in the Caribbean, where they thought the volcano was going to erupt, the scientists, so they described that to the emergency management agencies, who called for an evacuation, and the volcano didn't erupt. And people, they're living in emergency shelters, they're not farming, they don't have a way to provide food for their families, and then they start to have a lack of trust in scientists and the emergency management agencies, and then they go back to their houses and their fields to start farming, and then of course you have an eruption, which isn't predictable, and you can't evacuate those people in time, and unfortunately it leads to sort of fatal outcomes. Yeah. Good question. Hmm. Maybe, I guess, people are most familiar with hazards that are in their own backyard. So here in Australia, because we have bushfires, people are aware that of the ways in which they have to be prepared and aware. Like, awareness doesn't equal preparedness, but they're aware of the hazard, and to some degree they're prepared for it. And for example, so that's the main hazard in Australia. But but in, say, places that get hurricanes, they've got certain levels of awareness and preparedness for those. And I think, with both of those hazards, they're somewhat predictable because they're influenced by wind and weather systems that we can predict with relative certainty. And I think maybe that translates to volcanic eruptions as well, where there's actually a lot of trust placed in volcanologists to predict the what, when, how big and how long. whereas, they're just different types of hazards, and we don't have that ability. And I think maybe that's an expectation that the public have that we just can't meet. I don't know if that's really a myth, but how do I deal with what, sorry? Sorry, I don't understand. How do I deal with stress? That's I don't think you'll talk to any academic that isn't stressed. How do I deal with it? Well, I think most geologists and people who are interested in earth sciences love the outdoors. And that's a nice part of our job, is that we get to do field work relatively often. And I think one way that we alleviate stress is through doing outdoor activities like bushwalking and those sorts of things. And so I think that's probably the way that I work through that. In Tasmania, yeah, just around Hobart. I'm not sure if you've ever been to Tasmania, but it's the bush is everywhere. It's at the back, our back door here in Hobart. Yeah. A top success tip. Yeah. So I guess the first thing that sort of comes to mind, just because I'm working with PhD students quite a lot, is that your intellectual capacity is just one part of becoming a successful scientist. And the other part is really sort of a dedication to your science or to your job. And at times you just need to work really hard. There's no getting out of it. It doesn't matter how smart you are, you just need to get to work. Yeah, I think that would be it. No worries. Okay, thanks.